Alcman was a 7th century BC poet who composed 6 books of choral poetry in the Doric dialect of Sparta. Much of his poetry was lost during the Middle Ages, and we only possess fragments of his Parthenon, which are typically composed for girls singing in a chorus. In one fragment, Alcman turns to one of the girls and says, "Lusimele te posso, takero tera tu huppo kai sanato, potiterketai." In limb relaxing longing, she looks more meltingly than sleep and death. In this excerpt, we are seeing the intermingling of what appear to be opposites. This erotically impressionistic image associates the seeming parallels between sleep and death, hypnos and thanatos. The girl is observed in a state of longing, somehow in a luxuriating manner echoing the pose of immobility that is brought about after death's caresses. The poet is looking upon her with desire, and through his evocation of this image is enticing the listener of the poem to do the same. The entire field of perception that includes longing, sleep, and death is enveloped by the charms of Eros and Aphrodite. This becomes apparent to us in the expression limb relaxing, which is used by the poets of antiquity to describe the effects of death upon the warrior, after which hypnos, or sleep, enshrouds his eyes with a crepe of darkness. But for us, hypnos visits only temporarily, allowing us to recover our strength and vitality. But for the dead, such veiling betokens a more permanent cessation of sight. The girl's longing or desiring, or hopothos, implies, according to Socrates' understanding of the term, a lack or deficiency. Since desire arises from absence, from things which we do not possess, hopothos, or longing, creates a mirror image within our own soul, so that her desire, or Alcman's desire, becomes our own. The two movements of desire seek a resolution and union in the imaginative plane. Pothos, if we recall from an earlier video, is a companion of Aphrodite, along with Peto, or persuasion. He is also the son of Eros. Freud popularized the notion of the opposition between Eros and Thanatos, desire and death, and interpreted it in conformity with his own understanding of psychoanalysis. But what is rarely discussed is the link between Eros and Thanatos, which is mediated by the power of sleep. In fact, sleep is such an incredibly important auxiliary of Aphrodite's power that wooden statues of it have been found on the Acropolis in the temple of the Aphrodite warrior. Similarly, images depicting death and sleep can also be found in the shrines of Aphrodite Ambologiera, or Aphrodite who postpones old age. She spoke. From her breasts unbound the elaborate pattern-pieced strap, and on it are figured all beguilements, and loveliness is figured upon it, and passion of sex is there, and the whispered endearment that steals the heart away even from the thoughtful. Such is the description we find of Aphrodite's girdle, which has the magical ability to inspire desire in others, including our mournfully desiring girl. In the Iliad, Aphrodite has imbued Hera with the charms to seduce her husband Zeus by lending her the girdle. And after Hera inflames his erotic passion and fulfills his desire for union, inspired by the arts of Aphrodite, the all-powerful Zeus is overcome by sleep. Such is the cosmic power of Aphrodite and Eros. So spake she, and ox-eyed queenly Hera smiled, and smiling laid the zone in her bosom. She then went to her house, the daughter of Zeus, Aphrodite, but Hera darted down and left the peak of Olympus. On Pieria she stepped in lovely Amathia, and sped over the snowy mountains of the Thracian horsemen, even over their topmost peaks, nor grazed she the ground with her feet. And from Athos she stepped upon the billowy sea, and so came to Lemnos, the city of godlike Thoas. There she met Sleep, the brother of Death, and she clasped him by the hand, and spake and addressed him, "Sleep, Lord of all gods and of all men, if ever thou didst hearken to word of mine, so do thou even now obey, and I will owe thee thanks all my days. Lull me to sleep the bright eyes of Zeus beneath his brows, so soon as I shall have lain me by his side in love. Of course, this is all part of Hera's plot to temporarily incapacitate Zeus while she interferes again in the Trojan conflict without his knowing. This capacity of Aphrodite to overpower Zeus is something rather unsettling for the god, and suggests a power greater and more primordial in its potency. Although she is commonly understood as the daughter of Zeus, it is important to recall that the Hesiodic Aphrodite is not even an Olympian, and her father is not in fact Zeus, but Zeus's grandfather, Uranos, whose name signifies the one who conceals. This obscurity and covering very much mirrors Aphrodite's relationship with Hypnos and Thanatos, who also act in a similar fashion by covering the eyes of the subject upon sleep and death. Sleep and darkness, along with Aphrodite's powers, all involve forms of binding. After all, upon the death of the Titans, Zeus's thunderbolts flash and blind them, and henceforward they are called Chthonioi, and therefore belong to the sphere of night. Just as sleep binds us in darkness until we emerge once again into the daylight. Aphrodite's primordial powers have the potential to subvert Zeus's entire domain, and she therefore poses a considerable threat. Despite thousands of years of cultural creativity surrounding Aphrodite's image and myth, along with our preconceived notions of the goddess, it is important to explore a deeper unveiling of her personhood, and to dispel the false notions that have accumulated over the centuries. I want to echo the remark of Gabriella Peronti, that Aphrodite is not the goddess of love nor peace, nor is she the goddess of sex, with a few reservations added of my own. Aphrodite is indeed not a goddess of love, Ares is not a god of war, and Poseidon is not the god of the seas. In fact, the point is well made that the Greeks did not limit their gods by assigning them gods of something. That is simply not how they understood the deities. Another thing to remember is that each god or goddess is a divine individual, and that individuality is not reducible to a circumscribed archetype. This is a deeper meaning to a polytheistic conception of the gods. The gods and goddesses are not your psychic processes, they're not your emotions, nor predictable configurations in your astrological natal chart. You cannot reduce the unique personality of a god to a set of definitions or functions. And even to speak of deities as being primarily expressions of divine powers is only a part of the picture. They encompass all these attributes and much more besides. To compound this complexity is the notion that polytheistic societies not only contain a multitude of gods, whose ultimate number is unknown and unknowable within a given pantheon, but also that the god or goddess posing the same name is not in fact various aspects of a singular individuality, but each is simultaneously a unique individuality itself. Therefore, there are multiple Aphrodites. This may seem unnecessarily chaotic and complex, but we must be reminded that this is a result of our own philosophical inheritance and metaphysical presuppositions, which seek to reduce all multiplicity to an ultimate unity. The ancient Greeks did not share this need for neat theological systems. Our need to reduce and organize complexity and proliferating multiplicity is our problem, not theirs. In the case of Aphrodite, her primary powers include the capacity to provoke eros and establish intimate relationships, leading to the act of sexual union through a mixing of beings on multiple levels of reality. Aristotle refers to an expression that was spoken of her, ten kurion theon tes mixeos, the goddess presiding over mixes. Her mixing forces the four elements that would originally have preferred to stay separated and self-sufficient in a state of homoousia. This can be seen in Empedocles' cosmology, where the cycles of love, or philotes, and strife, or nekos, alternate, beginning first with a separation of all four elements under the dominion of strife, which are then combined and formed against their will into a mixture that creates the cosmos. For this reason, she is sometimes called philotes, which can be translated as love, but to see in this understanding something akin to a Christian love or a romantic love would be a mistake. Peronti emphasizes that conventional understandings of Aphrodite have reduced her to an image of femininity. Quote, "The incarnation of love and beauty, alternatively associated with grace, tenderness, and harmony, or with seduction and deception. As Nicole Leroux has said, a goddess is not a woman. But when it comes to Aphrodite, everyone tends to forget this poignant statement. Perhaps love can be an outcome of the act of sexual mingling, but love in the commonly accepted notion is not her primary function. In Empedocles' system, Aphrodite is imagined in the middle of the cosmos spinning, and it is perhaps the spinning and spiraling movement of her girdle that emanates outward from the center to the periphery, until at last strife attains enough power to overcome her magic and break her bonds. The swirling movement emerged from her, quote, mid-parts, which have connotations of the abdominal region, but also subtly reference and imply the human genitalia. There is certainly a joyousness or exaltation to Aphrodite, but her joy derives in part from a subjugation of the autonomous will of the elements, which seek a perpetual state of separation. It should also be remembered that in Empedocles' cosmology, the elements are simultaneously gods. They are not what moderns would understand as constituting the periodic table, nor are they simply atomistic. But without this mixing, nothing would be. In the collection of writings known as the Hermetica, we have reference to our world that contains the incarnated and incarcerated human being, who is simply referred to as a harmonized slave. Just as strife can release us from the bonds and chains we've been ensnared in by Aphrodite Philotes, the seeming charm and grace of love can be held responsible for imprisonment to the body and the senses. In ancient thought, truth is not a stable set of propositions, and lightness and darkness, veiling and unveiling, blend into one another and obscure any certain or fixed notions of final answers and dogmatic assertions. As Butler observes, and as I've mentioned before, Aphrodite's movement of consolidation and intermingling of opposing forces also results in forms of human organization that we'd understand as cosmopolitanism or internationalism. It is the emergence of strife within the economy of powers among political and national entities that inspires a need to reassert individuality, that in this level of analysis would correspond to feelings of nationalism. Such feelings quite possibly emerge from a sense of a threat taking the form of an all-encompassing globalism that always threatens the self-identity of a particular entity by weaving it into a larger whole. I am sympathetic to Peronti's critique of a one-sided, stereotypically feminine caricature of Aphrodite, but I believe that her intention is not to outright dismiss certain qualities of the goddess like grace, beauty, and seduction, but rather to de-emphasize those traits in order to showcase the multifaceted and sometimes surprising characteristics of the goddess that the literature and iconography can easily demonstrate. The notion of Aphrodite embodying peace and love is not attested to in the most ancient texts. In fact, we have early representations of her participating in the gigantomachia, armed with weapons, and in combat with giants. In this role as warrior goddess, she shows herself as the martial companion and partner in arms of Ares. In fact, in Hesiod's Theogony, they are considered a couple, whereas in Homer's Iliad and Odyssey they are presented as siblings. There is a primordial connection and synergy between the two gods. We have an amphora, or Greek vase, that depicts Aphrodite mounted on a chariot next to Poseidon. She is wearing an aegis, which is the distinct robe of Athena, echoing Athena's attributes and powers. Her place beside Poseidon on the chariot can also suggest that she is taking on the identity of Aphrodite, the goddess of the sea. Rather than the artist having a confusion of identities between the goddesses, this suggests to me that there are distinct overlaps between Aphrodite's powers and these other goddesses in this particular scenario or domain. Peronti notes that there is a, quote, functional affinity between Aphrodite and Athena, since in the Spartan Acropolis, Aphrodite Area, Aphrodite of Ares, was worshipped alongside Athena Poliukos, guardian of the city. What we should see here is the protective and military role that Aphrodite also plays in defense of the polis and in the battlefront. We have sources that describe women in Corinth seeking prayers to her in order to arouse in their warriors the ferocious power of, quote, the Eros of battle. But she was not only worshipped by women. In fact, we have evidence of soldiers, commanders, and all sorts of military personnel engaged in her cult worship both before and after a battle. Her epithets include strategis, of the commanders, or strateia, of the army. Perhaps the similarity of Amphitrite in the amphora is also an indication that Aphrodite also presides over sea and naval battles. Her association with naval battles also means that she presides over maritime enterprises like navigation and the protection of harbors. After all, the goddess emerged in Cyprus, born from the foam of the sea. Hence her name includes the root aphros, meaning foam. There can be a tendency to view complementarity and conjunction of opposites as a finite field horizontally arranged, where one pole occupies a space that precludes the other. We have inherited some of this conventional thinking by seeing Aphrodite opposed to Ares, or even complementary to Ares, as love is to war, for instance. If we do not see these two forces in hostile opposition, then many of us at least conceptualize this polarity as residing on a spectrum or a gradient. But what is being suggested here is that Aphrodite is just as comfortable in the domain of war as Ares himself. We should begin to see that her relationship with Ares should be viewed as a vertical superimposition. These two gods share such deeply sympathetic resonances that they overlap in function and activity. In fact, the very name Aphrodite was sometimes considered synonymous with warrior fury. At this point, it should not be surprising when we recall Empedocles' cosmology, where appearances may suggest harmony and cohesiveness, but erotically motivated expansion and assimilation lie just beneath the surface. Recall also the story of Hephaestus setting a trap to net Aphrodite and Ares in flagrante delicto. Although she is technically married to Hephaestus in a hieros gamos, it is evident that marriage is not reflective of her true nature, and that there is an echo of her Hesiodic self, which saw her as companion and partner to Ares. In an interesting passage, Peronti asks, quote, "But how do we explain the passage in the Iliad where Zeus assigns to Aphrodite the erga gamoio, the works of gamos, or marriage, and bans her from the polemia erga, works of war, reserved for Athena and Ares?" She then answers, quote, "These words of Homer's Zeus do not actually constitute a theological statement. They take on their full meaning once they are put back into the narrative context of the poem. The sovereign god's words reveal neither the real nature of Aphrodite, nor her exclusion from the world of war in general, but to confirm through a commentary tinged with irony that this goddess, allied to the Trojans, had to move away from the battlefield. There is a deeper reason for her association with the more virile and aggressive masculine attitude that can also be found in the Hesiodic myths. Not only does she possess warlike energy and vitality traditionally associated with masculinity, her very power is an incredible threat to Zeus's reign. We saw earlier how even Zeus can succumb to the forces of Eros and Hypnos. These are primordial forces that pre-exist his reign. In fact, they even pre-exist the birth of his grandfather Uranus. Zeus even had at one point to curb her proclivity to encouraging union between gods and mortals, lest a new force emerge that could challenge Zeus's reign. There's even a somewhat tragic dimension captured by Stesichorus' poem Geryoneus, in which the figure of the giant Geryon lives his life in uncertainty as to whether he is mortal or immortal, given his mixed ancestry, thereby confusing his status as a divine being, which ultimately is to be decided upon combat with Heracles. Such blurring of boundaries and distinctions is an inherent activity of Aphrodite. The theogony begins with three primordial divinities acting together: Eros, Gaia, and Chaos. Gaia provides the cosmic foundation for all things, and Eros provides the procreative or generative function. It is only after the spontaneous emergence of Eros that the mechanism of procreation enters the cosmos. In this sense, Eros is the progenitor of Aphrodite, and later re-emerges in a re-embodied configuration as her child with Ares, which places Eros within the social realm of human beings. After Kronos castrates Uranos, his genitals fall into the Pontos, which is the salt sea, also known as, quote, the fruitless deep. In this sense, Aphrodite is not technically an Olympian, although she is later incorporated as Zeus's daughter in later traditions. She is in fact born from two fathers, Uranos and Pontos. Butler makes a very interesting observation regarding the true nature of Pontos' chemical composition. Given the epithet of fruitless deep and salty sea, he suggests that we can understand his daughter Aphrodite's nature as being primarily associated with eroticism rather than its byproducts. Aphrodite therefore is not terribly concerned with reproductivity. Also, after the castration of Uranos, the blood itself produced the giants and the vengeful Erinyes, who are both entities that are associated with wars and conflicts. Perhaps next time you gaze upon the birth of Venus by Botticelli, you will be able to see through the calm facade and composed gentleness of the goddess and detect the traces of hidden powers in this deeply misunderstood deity. One of the most beautiful devotees of Aphrodite is the poetess Sappho. For anyone who cares to immerse themselves in the radiance of this goddess and her dynamis, I cannot recommend her poetry more. But I want to take the last portion of this video to discuss a poet of the Augustan age who was deeply influenced by Hellenistic poetry. Sextus Propertius was a Latin poet born around 50 to 45 BC in what is now the town of Assisi in modern Italy. Much like the romantic devotional poetry immortalized by Dante and Beatrice, Petrarch and Laura, Propertius predates them both, with his Cynthia. Much of his poetry is erotic in nature, and he speaks of love with slavish devotion and torturous highs and lows, and imbues his Cynthia with the qualities of a goddess, almost cruel in her command over his senses and his heart. But in his exploration of the intertwining of love and death, his Cynthia becomes a paragon of the powers of Aphrodite, but also the darker powers of the goddesses like Hecate, with her manifest associations of sorcery, bewitchment, and magical potions. In Book 4, Poem 7, entitled Cynthia's Ghost, we can see suggestions of Hecate in the sexual congress that occurs at the crossroads between the poet and his lover, an established location for the presence of this goddess. What is happening in this poem is Venus's sexualization of the uncanny atmosphere of a nocturnal tryst of lovers, infused with the contamination of the macabre elements of Hecate. There is a distinct whiff of evil and ghoulish forebodings in this erotic encounter. Let us read the stanza. Traitor, from whom no woman need expect good faith, can you have fallen asleep so soon? So soon forgotten stolen joys in the wakeful Subura? Those tricky nights in my worn windowsill, from which time and again I hung on a rope for you, descending hand under hand to your embrace? We often shared Venus at the crossroads, breast to breast, our cloaks warming the road. Alas for that secret understanding whose specious words death's southern winds have blown away. In Propertius's explorations of Eros and desire and death, he is experiencing the darker powers these feelings evoke. This interplay of love and death will be explored in the 18th to 19th centuries during the Romantic movement, culminating in the decadent and symbolist movements at the beginning of the 20th century. As Walter Pater summarizes, quote, "With a passionate care for beauty, the romantic spirit refuses to have it, unless the condition of strangeness be first fulfilled. Its desire is for a beauty born of unlikely elements, by a profound alchemy, by a difficult initiation, by the charm which wrings it even out of terrible things, and a trace of distortion of the grotesque may perhaps linger as an additional element of expression about its ultimate grace." If anything, Aphrodite's presence is felt even more today, where every image evokes an erotic encounter with our psyche. Sadly, the depth and profundity of her scope and her powers is lost on most of us, who see her as nothing but a unidimensional archetype of strictly defined abstract concepts, rather than an ever-living dynamic presence and individuality. No wonder the mighty Zeus himself was wary of her cosmic powers, with her capacity to arouse erotic beauty mixed with the capacity to incite horror. Let us end with a poem by Propertius that evokes love's sometimes forgiving, but always domineering and ubiquitous presence. Although spoken in reference to a masculinized Eros, these words can easily be applied to Aphrodite herself. It is entitled, "No Escape from Love." Ah, mindless, where do you run? There's no running away. Though you run to the Tanais, love will still follow. Not if you ride the air on the back of Pegasus. Not if the wings of Perseus speed your feet, or if breezes cleft by winged sandals sweep you along, will Mercury's highway help you at all. Always love presses on the lover's head, and settles heavily on the neck once free. As guard, he keeps a strict watch, and will never let you lift your eyes from the ground once they are caught. But if you should offend, he is a forgiving God, if only he sees prompt repentance. Take care for now.